Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist moving to the University of Colorado Boulder back home in the Rocky Mountain States as of fall 2017. But for longtime watchers of this channel, I have been teaching at the University of California, Berkeley for the last 2 years, and as of now, the end of June 2017, I am at Berkeley for another 7 weeks teaching an intensive summer course in Norse myth. So for another month and a half or so, I'll be making videos here at Berkeley instead of in the Wild West. Oh well, I work with what I've got. So I'm back today with another video about a poem in the Poetic Edda. So the Poetic Edda is a compilation of poems in the Old Norse language that are collected mostly in a manuscript called the Codex Regius, which was written down in Iceland in the 1270s AD. However, these poems were almost certainly composed orally much earlier, centuries earlier than the Codex Regius was written down, and so they form our best source for the mythology of the Norse gods and heroes from the pre-Christian era. In previous videos, I've talked about Völuspá, the poem about the beginning and end of the world, Hávamál, the poem about Odin's wisdom, Lokasenna, the poem about Loki insulting the gods, Hörvarsljóð, about Thor and Odin insulting each other, and Grímnismál, where Odin reveals his names, and Völuspá and Skama, or Hyndluljóð, where the story of the end of the world is also told in a little bit more abridged form. Þrymskviða is a little bit different from all of these because it's actually kind of funny. It probably is intended to be funny. It's a fairly short poem. It's in the meter called Fornirðislag, which is the same meter that, for instance, Völuspá is in. It's kind of the typical meter for telling a story in an Old Norse poem in the Edda. It's very similar to the meter used in Beowulf or Hildebrand's Lied or other poems in other Old Germanic languages. And its title is pretty simple. Kviða just means poem, and Thryms is the possessive or genitive form of a giant named Thrymr. Just like in English, possessive S is added to most names, or in this case most masculine names in Old Norse, to make their possessive form, although without an apostrophe in Old Norse. As I'm often pointing out on this channel, this is the letter Thorn. That means the TH sound in words in English like thin, breath, worth, or indeed Thor. And this is the letter E. This is the sort of rare capital form because I've written this whole word in caps. That looks like a D with a slash through it. That's the TH sound in words like then, breathe, or worthy in English. So Þrymskviða, to use reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation. As usual, I'm using reconstructed pronunciation rather than modern Icelandic pronunciation. You can find guides to both kinds of pronunciation on my channel. So in Þrymskviða, Thor and Loki, who normally are presented as though they are deadly enemies, and certainly at Ragnarok, Loki is going to lead the giants and monsters against the gods and kill them. Instead, Thor and Loki are presented as sort of like mismatched partners in a buddy cop movie. This isn't the only story from the Norse myth in which this is true. For instance, in the story of Utgard the Loki, which is told in the Prose Edda, a different book, we also have a story about Thor and Loki kind of being like mismatched buddies. But this is sort of notable because of the very truly comic tone of the whole thing. To begin with, Thor wakes up and he's missing his hammer. So I'm going to read some sample stanzas as I recap the story, reading in Old Norse first with reconstructed pronunciation, and then in English from my 2015 translation of the Poetic Edda. So stanza 1. Reiður var þó Vingþór, hann vaknaði, og síns hammars saknaði. Skegg nama trista, skor nama día, redjarðarbúr að þreifask. Thor was angry when he awoke and found his hammer had gone missing. He wrung his beard, he wrung his hair. The great Thor searched all around. So he summons Loki to help him find it. Mjölnir is, after all, his main tool and attribute and weapon for fighting against the giants. So if he's without it, the gods are sort of defenseless. Thor and Loki go together to Freyja and they borrow her fjaðarhamar. This is like feather skin. I translated it as feather suit. Whatever it is, it's something that Loki can put on and can fly with. So in stanza 5 we read, Fló Thor Loki, fjäderhamr dundi, uns för utan kom Åsagarda, och för innan kom Jotunheima. Then Loki flew, wearing Freya's feather suit. Its feathers whistled in the air, till he left Asgard and came within Jotunheim. Now, Asgarder, or often rendered in English as Asgard, is the realm where the gods live, and Jotunheim, Old Norse Jotunheimr, is where the giants live, the enemies of the gods. It's interesting that in this particular stanza, the names for those places are not rendered as single words, but as more like descriptors. Osa Garda is literally just something like the yards or enclosures or indeed gardens of the gods. Jotunheima, homes of the giants, are rendered actually more like descriptions than as actual titles. Sort of unusual. Well, there Loki finds Thrym tending to his dogs and horses, and Thrym asks why Loki has come into Jotunheim alone. Loki tells him the bad news and asks Thrym if it's Thrym who's hidden Thor's hammer, and Thrym replies in stanza 8, Ek hefi flóriða hamar folgin, åtta rostum fyrjord neðan. Han engi maður aftur heimtir, nema fyri mer froju at kvæn. Thrym said, I have hidden the mighty Thor's hammer 8 miles beneath the earth. No one will ever see that hammer again, unless Freya is brought here as my bride. Notice that since Old Norse poetry is alliterative, we don't use rhyme in the poems of the Poetic Edda, but rather alliteration, words that start with the same sound. The gods have sort of alternative names that can be used in order to alliterate with whatever words we need to alliterate with in a particular line or stanza. So here, for instance, the word hamar, which is hammer in Old Norse, just very similar to its English cognate, in the second line needs to alliterate with a word that has an H in the first line. And so instead of calling Thor just Thor, he has a sort of alternative name, a heiti, as we call it in Old Norse, that starts with H, and that's hlorithi, the possessive form of which is hlorida. So hlorida hamar is the hammer of Thor. Hlorithi just being an alternative name for him. Well, Loki comes back to Thor with the bad news, and Thor's first response is, of course, to march straight to Freya and say, hey, put on a wedding dress, we're going to Jotunheim. But Freya is not happy about the suggestion, as we see in stanza 13. Reið var þó Freya og fnassaði, allar ósasalar undirbifdisk, stók það it mikla menn brísinga. Mig veistu verða vergjarnasta ef ek með þér í Jotunheima. Freya was angry. She snorted so hard that the homes of the gods shook all around them. Her necklace Brísingamen trembled on her neck. They would call me a lewd, loose woman if I went with you to Jotunheimr. And her necklace Brísingamen, which isn't ever described in any particular detail, is something that's strongly associated with Freya. So the gods and goddesses meet to discuss the problem. If Freya is not going to go, how are we going to get the hammer back? And Heimdallr proposes a solution. In stanza 15, Þó hvað það Heimdallr, hvítastar ósa, vissi vel fram sem vanir aðrir. Bindum Thor brúðarlíni, hafi hann it mikla menn brísinga. Then Heimdall spoke, the handsomest of gods. As one of the Vanir, he could see the future. Let's put a wedding dress on Thor. Let him wear Freya's necklace, the Brísinga man. So notice this is one of the places where Heimdallr is called the whitest of the gods, hvítastar ósa here. The word, or the color white, Old Norse hvítar, is associated strongly with human beauty. And so my belief, having done a great deal of study of Old Norse color terms, is that what's implied by this is simply that he is the handsomest of gods. It would be sort of unusual to describe someone's skin as particularly white, especially a man's, and mean something positive by that, because usually to call a man white in skin implies that he is a coward, right? He's gone pale. It could mean that he's the blondest. That's something that could also be sort of inferred from the way that Baldur is described as being very white, or hvítur, in the prose Edda. So you might also take that as something like the blondest of gods. But since blonde here is also associated with attractiveness, the association is there regardless. Anyway, Thor is of course concerned about his reputation, and in stanza 17, Þó hvað það Thor þrúðugur oss, mig munu asir argan kalla, ef ek bindas glatt brúðarlíni. Then Thor, the strong god, spoke. All the Aesir would call me a sissy if I let you put a wedding dress on me. Now, that word that I translate as sissy is a word that we run into fairly often in Old Norse. We see it both in the form argr and in the form ragr with the R and the A reversed. I translate it as sissy because it's the kind of thing that the vocabulary for this changes decade by decade. You know, it's the kind of thing people make fun of each other by saying on the playground. It implies someone who does not fulfill the masculine ideal of Old Norse. So someone who is weak, someone who's cowardly, probably someone who's homosexual. And so, of course, Thor is the opposite of all these things. Thor is Drengr, and he doesn't want to be associated with anything like Argr behavior, and putting on a wedding dress is definitely Argr behavior. But Loki shushes him, reminds him that he'll never get his hammer back if he doesn't do this. So much to his chagrin and against his protest, Thor is dressed up in a wedding dress. Keys are draped from his belt. This was something that women wore keys around the belt because they're sort of the masters of the household. And then we have something interesting Loki says in stanza 20. Þó hvað það Loki, lávojar sonur. Mun ek ok með þér ambót vera. Við skulum aka tvá í Jotunheima. Then Loki, son of Laufey, said, Now I'll go as your serving woman. The two of us, man and woman, are going to Jotunheim. Now, the reason that I translate that as man and woman is that there is some kind of subtle joke going on here that's contained in one word in the Old Norse text. Old Norse is a gendered language, so adjectives can have a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter form. If we're talking about a group of all men, all males, then it's going to be masculine adjective. If we're talking about a group that's all women, it's going to be the feminine form of the adjective. But unlike Romance languages like French or Spanish, where if you have 99 women but one man in the group, you still use the masculine adjective. Old Norse, if there's a mixed group of men and women, will use the neuter. So, if you have the number 2, the masculine form of 2, tver, would mean 2 men. The feminine form of tver, 2, which is tvar, would mean 2 women. But the neuter, tvau, would mean a man and a woman because it's mixed 1 and 1. Which one is Loki calling the woman? You know, there's some kind of joke in the ambiguity here because he could be calling Thor the woman, you know, kind of needling him while Loki still looks like a man. But maybe since Loki is also such a consummate shape changer that he's even had children as a female, maybe he's calling himself the woman and still calling Thor the man. Probably the ambiguity is very deliberate and part of the humor. Well, they jump in Thor's chariot pulled by his goats and they drive off to Jotunheimr, and the journey takes several days. They get there and a wedding feast is prepared, and at the wedding feast, Thor arouses a little bit of suspicion. Stanza 24. Var þar at kveldi komið snemma og Jotna fram borit. Ein ot oxa, åtta laxa, krossir allar, þær konur skildu. Drakk sivjar ver, sold through mjadar. Early in the evening the giants gathered, and ale was brought to all of them. All on his own, Thor ate a whole ox, 8 salmon, all the delicacies reserved for the women, and drank 3 whole kegs of mead. One of Thor's great achievements is that he's a great drykkjumaður, or an accomplished drinker. So Thrym is mystified by a woman who can drink this much and eat this much, but Loki explains it away in stanza 26. Satt in allsnotra ambót fyrir orð fan við Jotns móli. Åt veturfrøya åtta nótum, svo var hon óðfús í Jotunheima. But Loki, Thor's clever bridesmaid, found words to answer the giant's suspicions. Froya could not eat at all for 8 nights. That's just how eager she was to come here to Jotunheim. So we have kind of a big bad wolf thing, you know, your teeth are so long, Grandma. But Loki assures Thrym that this is in fact Froya. Now Thrym wants to kiss his bride, so he lifts back the bridal veil, but he's startled by the fiery eyes of Froya. For some reason, I guess he doesn't notice the huge red beard that Thor is characterized by. Loki again explains it all away. He says that Froya just couldn't sleep for these 8 nights. That's why her eyes are so red. She was just that crazily eager to come here to Jotunheim. This word, óðfús, like crazy eager, that's basically actually what this compound is. Óðs, crazy, mad, passionate. Fús is eager. Notice that Oath is also part of the name of the god Odin. He is the mad one, the crazy one. Now we get to the crucial moment, stanzas 30 through 32. Þó hvað það þrymur fursadróttin, berið þinn hamar brúði at vígja, leggið Mjólni í moja kne, vígið okkur saman vorar hendi. Hlóriða hugar í brjósti harðhugaður hamar þegði. Þrym drap hann fyrstan fursadróttin, og at Jótns alla lamði. Drap hann ina oldnu Jótna systur, hinn brúðfjór beðið hafði. Hon skelum hlaut för skillinga, en hog hammars för hringa fjólð. Svo kom Óðins sonur ender at hamri. Then Thrym, king of giants, spoke, bringing the hammer to bless the bride. Lay Mjolnir on the bride's knees. May Vor, goddess of wedding vows, bless us. Then Thor, that tough-minded fighter, laughed with a full heart, gripping his hammer. First he killed Thrym, king of giants, then he crippled all the giants' kin. Then he killed the giant's old sister, the one who had asked him for the customary gift. She received a blow instead of money, a hammer to her head instead of golden rings. And this is the way Odin's son got his hammer back. And that is the conclusion of Þrymskviða, ending in kind of a rhapsody of Thor beating the skulls of giants, which is, after all, one of his major functions. In fact, one of the closest things to prayers that we find in the corpus of Old Norse poetry are basically these hymns to Thor breaking skulls. Another example, an isolated stanza by this poet named Veturliði Sumarliðason. Leggi braudsleiknar lamðir þrívalda, staup þeir starkedi, stett of Gjóp dáða. You broke the limbs of Laken, you lamed Thrívaldi. You made Starkas stoop, you stepped over the corpse of Gjóp. So, Thor, as consummate giant skull breaker in, is now restored to his hammer, and order is again in the universe, at least for a while. I hope that this has been a useful elucidation of the poem Þrymskviða for you. I hope that you'll also look, if you haven't, at some other videos in this channel that concern other poems in the Poetic Edda. Lokasenna, about Loki's insults for the gods, certainly ties in with Þrymskviða a little bit. Or if you want to see the darker side of things, there's Völuspá, in which the creation and destruction of the world is narrated. Thanks very much to all my Patreon supporters who have continued to help me make these videos available. And if you haven't yet, I hope to check out my Patreon page. Consider donating even $1 a month. It gets you some exclusive content other people don't get to see. And I am very responsive to questions and requests from Patreon supporters. For now, from the University of California, Berkeley, I'm wishing all of you all the best.